Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president, and it is my great joy to be here tonight to talk a little bit about how the Jewish high holidays were celebrated in New York, in this neighborhood, in the Tenements at the turn of the 20th century. And I am fortunate to be here with my good friend and colleague, Lila Corwin Berman, Dr. Lila Corwin Berman, a historian at Temple University, who in the coming year will be joining us in New York at New York University as she takes on a new position in the Department of History and Jewish Studies. So Lila is also working on a book on American Jewish citizenship in the 20th century. But tonight, I guess we'll talk about the newly arriving, soon-to-be citizens and how they might have celebrated the holidays. I want to welcome all of you out who are watching virtually. I want to welcome back our members, our viewers. I want to thank all of you out in the audience who have made such nice donations to the Tenement Museum. That helps us make these free programs, so thank you very much for that. And we're gonna jump right in. We're gonna have a conversation for about 30 minutes, after which we're gonna have an amazing cantorial concert, which I'll introduce when we get to that point. Feel free to write questions and comments in the chat. We're excited to take your questions at the very end of the program. So also, if you get a chance, write in and let us know where you are watching from. Okay, should we go to the Tenements?
Yes, let's go to the Tenements. So if you've tuned into any of these programs before, you're going to notice that we're sort of turning the tables, because often Annie is asking questions of other people, but we have this extraordinary opportunity to talk to Annie about research that she's done. So I'm going to be putting her on the spot to really set the scene for us. When we think about the high holidays, I'm sure those of us who celebrate them can think of the different spaces where we have celebrated them. And our celebrations have probably changed depending on those spaces. So can you just tell us a little bit about what the high holidays would have felt like in the Lower East Side? What does it mean to be talking and having this conversation about people celebrating them in tenements and in this neighborhood?
Yes, and also I forgot, we should do this caveat and let everyone know that this does not count as holiday services. So if you are Jewish
totally
and you want to, get this, and this doesn't count. We're only talking about, and neither of us are rabbis. So
almost rabbis, both of us, and it completely counts.
Right. But what we're really trying to do is, like, from a historical perspective, get a sense of what people living in the tenements were thinking about. And so just to kind of rewind a little bit, this is, when we think about the Jewish Lower East Side, it's the turn of the 20th century. We're in the midst of a great wave of migration, leaving Eastern Europe, leaving the Russian Empire for the most part, and coming to New York. And coming to New York in such large numbers that this neighborhood, which had previously been a German immigrant neighborhood known as Kleindeutschland, becomes, over the years, known as the Jewish Lower East Side, or the Jewish Quarter, or sometimes the Jewish Ghetto, depending on who was writing about it. And so you have also, at the same time, what will become the largest Jewish city in the world and the most densely populated neighborhood in the world, neighborhood in the country, and most likely in the world. So you have this amazing density of Jews living in these tenements, and no matter where they had come from, whether they were from Russia, this part of Russia, that part of Russia, Romania, Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when they get here, they're all living in tenements. So this structure is really important for kind of almost creating like the common denominator, the common living experience. So I think the other thing to think about when we think about the high holidays is that religious life is in the midst of, everything is in flux, everything is changing. People have to figure out new ways of ordering their religious lives, because here in this country, the work week extends from Monday through Saturday. So often people are working on Saturday, which is the Jewish Sabbath, or they're contending with that in some way. Maybe one family member is, but another isn't. And so when you get to the high holidays, people have to figure out how to celebrate it. And I think the other thing that's important with regard to space, which is a great way of looking at it, is that there weren't enough synagogues on the Lower East Side. There weren't enough congregations on the Lower East Side to accommodate all the people that wanted to come out and pray for this 10-day period, from starting with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and lasting through Yom Kippur. So they had to figure out where to pray, who to pray with it. Mm-hmm.
But you're saying that kind of makes me think that, well, if there weren't enough synagogues, obviously the high holidays are very important, but there's lots of other times in the Jewish calendar when people would maybe go to a synagogue. So when you were talking about the tenement space and the density, what were the ways in which people who were living in this neighborhood at the turn of the 20th century were thinking about ordering and organizing their lives according to Jewish ritual and Jewish tradition? And to what extent did the landscape of not just the neighborhood, but like the bigger city, allow people to be maybe a little more individualistic about how they thought about their behaviors?
Yeah, I think that's a great, I mean, in New York and in this country, there's such a premium placed on the individual. And so as soon as people are coming here, and don't forget, like one of the big reasons why this Jewish migration is coming in such large numbers is because of economic restrictions in the Russian Empire and outside of it. And so, you know, it was really hard to make a living for your family. And so you have this huge family migration coming over. And then it's exacerbated at different moments in time because of pogroms, attacks on Jewish life and property that, you know, people are like, okay, we have to come to this country. And so Jews come in large numbers, they come pretty quickly. But they have to, you know, there's almost like a kind of this emphasis on finding a job to support your family. And here, they're no longer on the margins of the economy. They're a central part of the economic landscape, which then means that that requires work that is going to interfere sometimes with study, which is going to interfere sometimes with prayer, and is going to reorder the ways that people approach this. And so you have this, again, in this place where there's such an emphasis on the individual and what the individual can accomplish. How then, an essential part of the high holidays is to come together as a collective. You can't just pray individually. Like, that doesn't count. You need to be with a group of people.
Counts.
This counts. Yeah, this counts. That you have to be in a collective. And so, yeah, how are you going to find the space on the Lower East Side with not enough synagogues? And
right.
That?
So you've like raised this problem that there's something about the high holidays that even if on a normal Sabbath, on a normal Saturday, somebody might not be looking for a synagogue to go to, and so there might not be the capacity. The high holidays, there's demand.
Yes, I mean, I think a part of it is like in the nature of this holiday, which is about, you know, Rosh Hashanah is known as the Jewish New Year, but it has other names, like the Day of Judgment is one of them, the Day of Remembrance, the Day of the Sounding of the Shofar. But the Day of Judgment, I think, is really helpful in understanding what people were thinking about. So there's this 10-day period that begins with the beginning of the Jewish New Year, and what you're doing is you're going to synagogue, and this is a shorthand. This is not the most, but you're going and you're praying to be inscribed in the book of life for the next year. You want it, and for you and your family and for others. And then the idea is on Yom Kippur, the book, it's sealed, and so you have this 10 days of being judged. I think that's so important. And I think people felt that. There are there are accounts of the time. A man named Zalman Yaffa wrote an account in a memoir that we have here that he writes about the shul. The synagogue was different. There were many more lights, and it was much more crowded. All the men sat with shoeless feet, and nobody ever dreamed of opening a window. Everybody prayed with feverish intensity. There was none of the lightness that was often present on the ordinary Sabbath. From the women's section came the sound of weeping and wailing. To me, it was always a physical and emotional upheaval. Something big and overwhelming was happening to us, to all Israel. What was it all about? I would rush out of the synagogue when services ended. So this, like, in some ways captures this intensity, and you see this over and over again in contemporary reports of who was praying and what was happening, talking about people literally like crying and weeping, right? So there's this intensity, and I think that intensity is motivating people who maybe weren't as observant as they had. Their observance had changed. But when the high holidays comes about, you have to go, and you have to bring your children there.
So if you have this population that's maybe not regular synagogue goers, and there are synagogues, of course, on the Lower East Side, right? It's not as if there aren't any. But what steps into that void? How do people find places where they can have that experience, where they can feel moved, where they can be with community, if there aren't these spaces? What's the what is the kind of improvisation that
Right. So it's interesting. We're in a saloon now.
Right.
We're in it, but the time period is a little off. But this space was a German immigrant saloon, and there were still saloons on the Lower East Side at the time of the Jewish migration, and many saloons were made into synagogues. Dance halls were made into synagogues, moving picture theaters, all sorts of spaces, political halls, meeting halls, liquor stores sometimes were turned into synagogues. Who turned them into synagogues? They didn't just do it on their own. Businessmen stepped into the void, right? So that there's this kind of void of people not having enough synagogues to go to, people realizing, oh, this is a business thing. I'm going to go rent the saloon. I'm going to go rent the dance hall. I'm going to, make sure that there's the provisions that are needed, for the most part, to a Torah to read from. And of course, and the most important thing, Jeremiah, this is for you, the most important thing was the cantor. You had to have a cantor to lead the liturgy.
And to advertise that the cantor was going
yes,
to be there,
and
right?
actually, to that point, let's look at this image, which is great. This is from, I think the image you can see on your screen now are of two advertisements from the Yiddish newspapers, and one, you can see the one on the left is kind of a slightly later, it's one in the Bronx, and it's really like touting the cantor, and even the picture. Actually, all these ads, and the Yiddish newspapers, all of them, in this time period would have array of these kinds of ads announcing, and the one on the right is for Tammany Hall. So Tammany Hall, which was a huge political hall, was rented for high holiday services. And a lot of these ads mentioned Luftiga. It was airy. It was airy, it was spacious, in contrast to the crowded areas of the Lower East Side. So you have a range of different halls that are rented to kind of create the space. Businessmen jumping in, seeing the need, seeing the demand for tickets, printing tickets, hiring a cantor, putting the ads in the paper, and then that's how it happened. And so that like half of New York Jews, perhaps as much as half, were praying in synagogues that were not designed to be synagogues.
Right, because somewhere around a quarter, maybe slightly more Jews on the Lower East Side in the early 20th century were like synagogue members, right? But it wasn't a huge percentage of them. But if you've explained to us how much kind of like of a magnetic pull this holiday had, there is this both, way in which this is fulfilling a religious need, but it also becomes a kind of business enterprise, right? And
Absolutely.
the kind of blurring.
Absolutely, and people are using the knowledge they've learned to run their shoe store, to run a movie theater, to run whatever it is that they've run. Or you place an advertisement, like all of these kinds of profane business skills are actually used in to usher in this sacred time of prayer. And
I love the idea of the high holiday ticket because it's so tangible, and it's something I think for many of us, who have celebrated high holidays or who have been with families that are celebrating them, there's like a thing about, who has the tickets and are there enough tickets? And it's this weird thing because, sometimes also going to synagogue feels a bit like a chore.
Yeah.
So you're like buying this ticket for then sitting here a very long time.
I think a lot of people think the ticket buying thing is a contemporary experience.
Right.
But the very tenements themselves tell us it was not. If we didn't have the Yiddish newspapers to tell us, we found in this building, and I hope you can see on the screen now, two examples of tickets found underneath the floorboards of this very building. And so one of the tickets is specifically for slichus, which is a kind of asking for forgiveness, a study and prayer that happened in a synagogue on Allen Street, but was found in this building. I think we dated that to 1919. And there was another ticket that was found in the basement, actually, where we are now, in one of the fireplaces. And we couldn't read it because you can see it's really, really faded. But we put it, we zoomed in and we tried to look closely to try to figure it out. And you can kind of see it on your screens now. And I was able to make out that it said like Jitamir, and it was almost a Jitamir. So then I looked up that there was a synagogue, a congregation on 32 Orchard Street. And so these are tickets that people who lived in this very building bought to go to synagogue on the high holidays. But yeah, you had to have the ticket. And the tickets also often announced or kind of copied some of the same things that were in the advertisements. Like they're always saying, this splendid cantor, this wonderful choir. And some of the advertisements also really, we're talking the voice that the newspapers made fun of this touting of the cantor by saying like, the ads will say, this cantor has a voice greater than 500 Carusos, or this cantor has a voice greater than 50 canaries. Like all of this is kind of using American, I guess, advertisement to get people excited about this, but it's merging the traditional with American practices.
And like the whole level of commercialism, right? So I think in a kind of knee-jerk way, if you think about kind of spiritual experiences, you don't often think about ticket buying and transaction and, capitalism, maybe profit making. But there's something interesting that even these tickets kind of intimate that these things are more wrapped up together than, a kind of pure vision of what is spiritual and what is commercial might actually make it be. And I'm curious about other ways that you see that kind of I mean, we're seeing so many of these blurrings of secular and sacred and of commercial and spiritual. So tell us about some of the other elements
let's look at
of
these.
it.
We'll look at another advertisement. Let's see. Here, this is a neat one. This is from 1894, and it's, if you can sound it out, it says Ridley's. And Ridley's is not a Yiddish word, nor is it a Hebrew word. Ridley's is E.S. Ridley's department store that was on the corner of Grand and Orchard, just 2 blocks from here. And this is a long advertisement talking about hats and derby hats available and hosiery and all of these things. And then also noting that there are Lashana Toiva cards, high holiday cards that you would send to each other, which is its own topic, and we can look closely at some of these cards. But I want to point out, to your point about the sacred and the profane, or to the kind of the material as well as the spiritual, this reference to the derby hats made me think of a New York Tribune article that was written like around 1902. And this was very common. Like American-born reporters writing for the New York Tribune, the New York Times, the Commercial Advertiser, all these popular newspapers would send reporters to the Lower East Side or to other Jewish immigrant neighborhoods and like describe what was happening. Like, oh, look, all this, the pushcart market is open as people get ready for the high holidays, and describing what the high holidays were. And this one in particular said, this man went to a service and he saw, he said, I wasn't surprised to see an older gentleman with a gray beard beating his chest as he prayed. But I was surprised to see a young man wearing a fashionable derby hat. Maybe he bought it at Ridley's, doing the same thing with passion. And so it's not a thing, and I think often we think of you're either Americanizing or you're religious. You're either observant or you're with it. But like this was very much this time where I think these two things were kind of coming together. And this idea of dressing up for the holidays, I mean, that was also part of your being judged. So you have to look nice. And all sorts of oral histories from this time period that we have both at the Tenement Museum and that I've also heard other places. These would be oral histories that were done largely in the 80s and 90s of people who were born 1900, 1910, and they're reflecting on their childhood, but they remember in vivid detail you got your fall outfit, you got your wool outfit for Rosh Hashanah, for the Jewish New Year, and you got your spring outfit, your spring nice outfit, around the time of Passover. And this one woman, Minnie Furman, wrote, like, you know, if it was 80 degrees and Rosh Hashanah was like in September, as it often is, you'd wear that wool dress and that wool suit and you just sweat but you had to have the new outfit for this. And I think that is this really like sensory memory that speaks to the importance of this holiday and how it was made distinct in that way. It was made sacred for having these new clothes.
Right, so like the ways that materiality actually can kind of mark time and can be tied into ritual time. And you had mentioned the holiday cards, which is like one of my favorite things because my own grandmother sent Shana Tovas, and that was something that we always saw when we would go to her house for Rosh Hashanah. She would have all the ones she had received displayed on her mantle, and nosy me would go and look and who sent them. And it was, oh, and who is this cousin and whatever. And so I was surprised to learn that this was not, I would have thought it was a post-World War II kind of trend. But actually this was something that Jews in the Lower East Side were doing, so much so that apparently the Postal Service was trying to tell people to pace themselves a bit.
Yeah.
So tell us about some of these
It's true,
cards.
We have this quote from the U.S. Post Office. I think we even put it in here. You can see it yourself. So you can see this is Edward Morgan, who was the postmaster in 1910, basically saying, you know, trying to time the sending of holiday cards so that the Jewish postman would be able to take time off around the holidays. And other things, the religious newspapers also saying, women, don't send so many cards, or, you know, it's not appropriate to send to everyone. Being a little bit condescending about it, but, you know, don't make martyrs of the poor mailmen, and you know, send them after the holiday of Sukkot. Send them not so much for Rosh Hashanah, maybe send them for Sukkot, the harvest festival that came after. So, but this was serious business. This was serious work. First of all, 1 out of every 3 pushcart vendors, it was reported. I wasn't able to verify, but 1 out of every 3 pushcart vendors sold high holiday cards at this time. And even the department store, E.S. Ridley's, is selling them. And they ranged in price from 1 cent to $3.50, which is a huge amount. The price of meat, to give a context, is about 15 cents a pound. So, as we know from other tours. So there was this kind of this sending of all of these cards, a variety of cards to choose from. But I think it was very serious work, because these were women who were connecting. It was the work of kinship, as an anthropologist might say. They were doing all of this work to kind of knit people who were no longer together. Now that could be they're writing to people in the old country that they've left behind. It also could be their neighbor has moved to the Bronx and they want to stay in touch with that neighbor. And there's so much movement in this time period. There's so much migration over and over again that these cards are a way to create a community. And I think they're really important. You can see a variety of these cards. I think you can see on your screen now. We ordered, our curator Lana Dubin isn't here tonight, but she worked to order a whole array of cards from about 1900 to 1915 that we don't have them displayed in your grandmother's apartment or your grandmother's home, but we have them on the Rogoshevsky apartment, which is our circa 1915 apartment, just to kind of give a sense of this, the importance of the high holiday cards. There are some, oh my God, though, this is really interesting. So this is, what, does this look like a high holiday card to you, Lila?
These are reindeer, basically, on this card.
And what's on the trees?
Snow, and it looks like kind of a Christmas tree, right?
Yeah, okay, yeah. But it says on the bottom, like, you know, Lashana Tova Tika Sevu, but wishing you a peaceful New Year is at the top.
Right.
What do we make of this?
Right. Well, this was where I was thinking about, so first of all, like, these are a form of technology, right? And I was thinking about, like, the pandemic, right? And how we used technology to connect. And you know, this was like a way of connecting with people who were far and using the holiday as an occasion to do that work, which is really interesting. But it also, this card in particular, allows us to sort of zoom out. Like, of course, Rosh Hashanah is a Jewish holiday, and it's about Jewish community and Jewish collectivity. But in this city, where people are living so close together, and yes, this was a Jewish neighborhood, but lots of non-Jewish people also called this space home and have over the years. How do you think about the ways in which the high holidays in the Tenement Museum, not the museum, in the tenements, the real tenements.
We'll talk about that later.
We'll talk about that later, right? How did they actually become a kind of public face of being Jewish in this city, right? And not just a private kind of face.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, so I think that we've been talking a lot about how this plays out in the home or the pushcart markets and the Yiddish newspapers, but these were trends noticed by Americans and New Yorkers. As mentioned, the reporters wrote about it, which tells us that New Yorkers wanted to know what was going on. And these were respectful articles. It wasn't making fun of the practices. I mean, there was really like this is what's happening. This is what the Jewish New Year means. This is a biblical meaning. This is what it means today. This is, you know, going through all of that. Like I said, the post office is trying to give their Jewish postmen, at the time just men, you know, time off. The U.S. Treasury Department, all of these kind of government offices are trying to find ways to kind of give people off so they can celebrate the holidays. The police department didn't let the Jewish policemen off. There were 200 Jewish policemen circa 1905, but stationed them near the synagogues to kind of help deal with all the crowds. And the other thing, and this is a great visual of, to your point, the way that the city in some ways helped the celebration of the holiday. This is an iconic picture from the Library of Congress. It's the Brooklyn Bridge. You can see on your screen. And the practices of the people are dressed up, like they went to Ridley's, they got their clothes at the department store, and they're throwing bread in the water. This is tashlich. It's like a ritual that happens before the Jewish New Year, or part of the Jewish New Year, to kind of absolve yourself of your sins, kind of sending your sins away, to send.
Right, in a moving body of water.
Exactly. Right. And so, Roebling did not design the Brooklyn Bridge thinking, oh, this is good. This is a great place for tashlich. You know, the cables, the caissons, and a great place for tashlich, by the way. But I think that speaks to the ways that waves of immigrants and migrants and refugees who have made New York home adapt to the space that they have, and they bring their rituals, they bring their religion here, and they bring their cultures here, and the city is, in many cases, welcomes it. I was not able to find anything negative about this type of work. I mean, even the mayor got rid of for the purpose of Rosh Hashanah pushcart market. Typically on Sundays that was not allowed because of blue laws, but Mayor Seth Lowe in 1902 said, oh, you know what, this Sunday they can sell in order to get ready for the holiday. So the city is bending in all sorts of ways to accommodate this holiday, and it becomes part of it. And I think that's a universal, when we think of all different immigrant groups coming, bringing their culture, what are the ways that the city challenges the ways that you can celebrate, but what are also the other ways that the city accommodates? I mean, another way that New Yorkers think about all the time is alternative parking laws, but that is also kind of thinking about different ways that the city New York City historically has kind of welcomed different customs and then made that part of a broader kind of city calendar, really.
Right. And the public kind of display of it. And that's why I think this is such a neat image to kind of end on, because we've been both talking about all of these ways that family and community are stitched together, but that ends up in the city happening not just in the home, not just in the buildings, not just in the synagogues or the dance halls or wherever else was repurposed for a synagogue, but also on the bridges and on the streets. And so it becomes part of the urban fabric.
Absolutely.
So I think we're now going to transition.
I think we have to transition. Like I said, the biggest draw for the synagogue, the biggest draw to go to synagogue for many people, even people, and there are socialists talking about this, and they thought, I'm done with Rosh Hashanah. I don't believe in religion. I'm enlightened. But I want to hear the cantor. The cantorial music and the liturgy is so moving. It's such an important part of this holiday then and now, and so we're so lucky to have with us tonight someone who's multi-talented. He's an ethnomusicologist, he's a teacher, he's a musician, the leader of Sway Machinery, and also a researcher right now at UCLA. But we're so lucky he's here in New York tonight. Jeremiah Lockwood is going to perform a concert based on liturgical music. And the last thing I want to say about Jeremiah, I'm sure I'll say many more things, but when we go to the conversation, but his grandfather was a cantor, which is really kind of exciting to kind of think about this through line. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was incredibly fascinating, and I would have enjoyed listening to you guys for another hour. I feel like you're just scratching the surface.
We can make that happen.
All right, well, I'm going to say a few things about the music, but I'll start by playing, because maybe I shouldn't speak at all, actually. It might be nice. We'll see. עבודך הנביאים כוסוף וכוסוף לאמור כה אמר השם מלך ישראל וגואלו Hashem Tzevois, Ani Rishon, V'ani Acharon, Ani Rishon, V'ani Acharon, ומבלעודך אין אלוהיכם ונעמה. היו למושיעים בו הר ציון, היו למושיעים בו הר ציון, למושיעים בו הר ציון, לשפוט הר הסוף, לשפוט הר הסוף, סוף ויסולד השם המלוך ונעמה. ידי שם מלך והכל הארץ ויהום ידי שם אחד ושמה אחד וסוד הסחם כוסף לחמו שמע ישראל עדי שם לקנו עדי שם So that first piece was the Al Yudei Avodecha, and it's from the Malchius section of the Rosh Hashanah Musaf liturgy, what you'd hear in the morning of Rosh Hashanah in a synagogue. And it's what I sang is based on a very, very famous record. It was a huge hit record called V'al Yudei Avodecha from Zavel Kvartin, who was the name of a Kvartin. Kvartin was born in a small town in Ukraine. In the Pale of Settlement, and had major jobs singing in synagogues in Europe, and then migrated to the United States after the First World War. And he made records in Europe as well. He was among the first cohort of cantors to be recording, although not by any means the first. Every year, older records keep getting found. Sort of the history of Jewish records keeps getting stretched back. So, according to a collector who I was talking to recently, 1899 was the first cantorial record. But this record is from the interwar period. It was from 1928 and recorded in the Edison studio in New Jersey. And something about Kvartin's music is that it's intentionally hearkening back to a sound that's imagined as claiming the voice of the shtetl, of the small-town Eastern European Jewish life that at that moment in history was seen as being, if not lost, then extremely endangered. After the violence of the First World War and the patterns of migration. So in this period in New York City, records were being made that suddenly we're looking at the image of the small-town Jew as being something that was in need of preservation, and that was something that could convene a mass audience, right? That fascination and nostalgia and feelings of loss and pain around this imagined Jewish past was something that was fervently desired by a paying audience. So I'm going to play, this is another record a little bit later. It's from around 1950, but from the Malevsky family, who are important figures in American Jewish music. Samuel Malevsky, the father, was also a Ukrainian shtetl Jew who had major jobs in Europe and then came to the United States and made records before the Second World War, but then in the late 40s, early 50s, he started a family choir in which his daughter was the principal soloist, Goldie Malevsky. So this is one of many instances of women crossing this gender boundary in Jewish sacred music from back then, which is something we can talk about some other time. But this is one of their very, very famous records. Also, this is I'm playing nothing but hits today. This is Haben Yakeli, which is from Zichronis, so also from the Musaf, from Rosh Hashanah. Okay. Haben Yakeli, This is a piece from the Slichus service that Annie referred to just before. It's sort of kind of the beginning of the high holidays cycle, which usually on the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah is the first Slichus, and it's the beginning of this penitential period that prepares you for the spiritual transformation of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgies. So this is also very well-known piece from a cantor named Mordechai Hershman. It's Misratze Barachamim. Thank you. Now I'll play a piece from the Kol Nidre liturgy. This is from a record made, one of the very early cantorial records. This is from in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was a record made by Gershon Sirota, who was the first international star of Jewish recorded music. And he was the cantor of the Tzlomacki Street Synagogue in Warsaw, which was a very beautiful, massive structure where it wasn't only in New York where people were kind of combining capitalism and sacred culture. It was kind of like an opera hall, and audiences of around 1,000 or so people would come every week for the Sabbath services with the cantor and choir. And so this is one of the early records of Jewish music, and it's Ya'aleh, which is one of the piyutim for the Erev Yom Kippur, the first night of the Yom Kippur service.
Boker
Okay, I'm going to do one last piece. Is that okay? Okay. So this is a sort of a humbler piece of music. Its significance is more in the text in a way. It's from the Insana Tokef prayer, which is the kind of the centerpiece of one of the centerpieces of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur morning services. And it's because of the poetry, which has become familiar through the famous "Who by Fire" song that partially translates some of the texts by Leonard Cohen, but there are many settings of it. And this is kind of based on when I sang in the choir with my grandfather. This was partially improvised, but there's a refrain that comes back, which is familiar, and which I think the refrain is from Nisi Belzer, who was a cantor and composer of liturgical music in Ukraine, in Berdichev, which has the pedigree of being kind of the site of the modern style of Jewish prayer, in which the prayer leader puts God on trial, sort of flips the tables of the usual set of associations, and going back to the early Hasidic master Levi Yitzchak, who famously convened a Beit Din, a court of law, to accuse God for his many misdeeds to the Jews and to mankind. And so people say that the cantorial style is in a lineage with Levi Yitzchak of interceding on behalf of the people in almost a legalistic manner, but with the impassioned voice of an attorney defending his client. All right. So this is B'Rosh Hashanah Yikosevun. Rosh Hashanah Yikosevun, Ubeyom Tzem Kippur Yechosemun, B'Rosh Hashanah Yikosevun, Ubeyom Tzem Kippur Yechosemun, B'Rosh Hashanah Yikosevun, Ubeyom Tzem Kippur Yechosemun. Con kama yahavlun v'chama yibodehun, kama yahavlun v'chama yibodehun, v'rosh Hashanah yikosevon, v'yom tzem kippur yechosemun, yechosemun. Mi yomos, mi vokitza, mi lo vokitza, mi voesh, mi vomayim, mi vochadev, mi v'chayo. Hashanah yikosevun, v'yom tzem kippur yechosemun. Rosh Hashanah yikosevun, v'yom tzem kippur yechosemun. Mi vorochav u'mi votzama, mi vorachash u'mi v'magerefon, mi v'chanika u'mi v'sekilo, v'rosh Hashanah yikosevun, v'yom tzem kippur yechosemun, v'rosh Hashanah yikosevun, v'yom tzem kippur yechosemun. Mi anoach u'mi yanoach, mi shaket u'mi taref, mi sholech u'mi siyasat, mi yeroni, u'mi yasher, mi yashaper, u'mi yanom. Us hashovam, us afilam, utzinaka mervirin esroach hagezerno.
It's hard to transition. That is very heavy liturgy, very beautiful music. And it actually reminded me of something we didn't get to talk about. So as all of you, I'm going to give you a moment so you can gather your questions together, both online and in here. But just to kind of say that one of the things that I think people thought about a lot during this time period was what they could do, right? What they could do, and the Yiddish newspapers in some ways acted as a guide, printing almost like sermon, like the religious Yiddish newspapers, Morgen Journal, Tageblatt, printing almost like sermon, like our features about what you should be thinking about now, what you should be doing. When you're in synagogue, you should be doing this. But also, as the liturgy just told us, you're supposed to give tzedakah. You're supposed to give, I guess, charity, act righteously and support others. And they would direct that very to supporting schools, supporting congregations, supporting Jewish life so that Jewish life could be built here in America. But it particular times of the year, particular moments, looking to Europe as well and saying, in 1906, this is a year of pogroms. We need to help people abroad. And in 1916, when they're, in 1916, I can't remember if this is 1916 or 1917, a talk about all the suffering happening in Eastern Europe because of the war. And it says, in such a terrifying time will we Jews in America commit the greatest injustice if we go to Yom Kippur, as always, to go to pray, and then go away entirely forgetful of our duties to our unfortunate people and brothers. We are in a lucky situation. We live under the free, joyful sky of the United States. We know not the horrors of war, and we thus have the circumstances to do so much and to lighten the horrible fate of this great part of our people that swims in a deep sea of fearful sorrows. So there's this way in which this liturgy is connecting people in the midst of World War I and its aftermath to people in other parts of the world, but saying that Jews in America have a particular responsibility in this case. So it's just interesting to kind of think about people in tenements hearing liturgy that they might have heard elsewhere, but then being directed to kind of think about what role they had, whether they were tailors, whether they were, sewing machine operators, whatever it was, that these were the things they were supposed to be thinking about, and that this was a time to think about a collective. And not just lecturing. They would lecture the people too, as if you came to synagogue to just pray for yourself, forget it. I mean, really lecturing people in this really, really neat way. But so thank you. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for giving me a moment to collect my thoughts as well and to integrate this. But wanted to see if we have any questions from the audience about the music, about the time period, anything.
Are you suggesting that ticketing was an innovation that happened here, or is there evidence that it was earlier? And do you have any evidence of anyone objecting to it?
I think ticketing started. I mean, I know that it was very widespread here. I imagine in Europe there was a need for tickets as well when you're talking. And so this brings up a very good point. A lot of modernization, urbanization is happening in Eastern Europe at the same time that it's happening here. So sometimes we get this picture, and I apologize if we painted it like this today, but that back then it was traditional, everything stayed the same, and you come here and here's modernization. Things were happening on the other side of the ocean as well, for sure. I think here things just get accelerated.
I have a question about the music. On these more sort of commercial recordings of sacred music, was there kind of bigger and jazzier? Were there like backup singers or other kind of instruments being played of the sort that you wouldn't hear in the sacred spaces themselves and services?
So, thanks, that's a great question. The difference between the records and the actual experience in the synagogue is very marked, and the most important element being that elements related to time, basically, right? That you only get this one short excerpt of prayer, and that it's kind of turned into something like an aria or an art song because of its intertextualization, right? It's being plucked out of its traditional place and put into this other context, right? So there's a lot of controversy about whether or not this is ethically appropriate, or whether it shines well on the Jewish people, how it makes Jews look to the outside world, that their sacred rites are being turned into pop culture. And in terms of the way the records were produced, some were produced just with voices, but the traditional texture in the synagogue, the traditional instrumentation, so to speak, is a voice, the cantor's voice with choir. So the Meshoirim, or the choir singers, are a very important part of cantorial culture, and it serves as kind of like an apprenticeship channel for people who are going to enter into Chazanis as a career. But there were there were all kinds of orchestral arrangements. Kind of the most famous kind of record format would be voice and organ, right? Organ being something that was kind of an influence from church music, certainly, and then later on you have all kinds American cantors who are very, very influenced by jazz and by other forms of dance music. Moshe Oisher is probably the most famous, where he was also a star of Yiddish theater. And the Malevsky family, where the daughters Goldie and Trudy, who were and Goldie, as I mentioned, was a cantor herself and was the star soloist in the choir. They also had a band that's called the Marlin Sisters, where they sang jazz. So so they were definitely involved and able to code switch between different styles.
I have a follow-up question on that. I'm also curious how this cantorial music influenced music more broadly. I mean, we've heard so much about how urbanization and capitalism influenced the music, but I'm curious, like you mentioned Leonard Cohen, for example, and I'd love to hear more.
It's a good question. I mean, usually people think about the influence going the other way, right? That Jews absorb the music of their non-Jewish neighbors, of the majority culture, into their synagogue music, and this is a way of kind of creating a path towards psychological assimilation of a kind, right? That this is somehow it's going to uplift the community by having elements of prestigious music from European art music or church music. Well, that's a very, very common argument. In fact, that's the mainstream of cantorial music in the 19th century, really. And this kind of more Städteldicke stuff is kind of like I mean, it's not that it didn't exist in Europe, but it's very much a part of the American Jewish consciousness. So in terms of other people, non-Jews consuming cantorial music, we definitely know that there was a non-Jewish audience for the music, and that non-Jews would come to hear famous cantors in the synagogue. And the most famous recording star cantor was Yasila Rosenblatt, who had a whole second act in his career as a star of vaudeville, right? Who was on tour for years, with jazz artists and circus performers and the whole gauntlet of vaudeville performance. So to what extent that music had uptake in non-Jewish music communities is not an easy question to answer. It's not obvious. I would say that certainly in terms of the vocal culture, that Jews were known for having a very advanced vocal culture in this period, and that cantors served as voice teachers for non-Jewish opera singers especially. So in that respect, it's a very clear connection, although there were all kinds of kind of anti-Semitic tropes about opera singers who were also cantors, had a kind of like a schmerzig kind of sound is the term that people use. You can hear the Jew on them, basically. Okay.
So what I understand is that the traditional presentation during the holidays would be the cantor, the chorus, and possibly an organ. In your case, the instrumentals that you were playing, are you playing instrumentals that had been notated, or are these your instrumentals with the traditional singing? Because I also hear a tone of the blues in what you're playing.
You mean what I played just now?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's my take on the music, for certainly, yeah.
Okay, that's what I was curious. So it is your instrumentation then?
Yes.
Okay, very, very beautiful.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you.
Any questions from the
Yeah, I just want to report that there's about 150 people watching from all over the country and internationally, and lots of praise for you, Jeremiah. There was one question earlier on. Have you seen any evidence of how the pandemic of 1918 would have affected the ways in which high holidays would have been observed?
That is interesting. I think to do that, we'd have to look specifically at 1918, and I didn't see, but I will go and look. It's a great question. So tune in next year, for us to get to that. That's a great question. I think one thing I also wanted to add is that this is part of a series that the museum is doing where we're looking at a variety of different religious cultures. So our next kind of holiday focus will be on Christmas in the saloon, but where the saloon, the German saloon, was a home of the Christmas tree and all sorts of Christmas music and foods. And so it's really interesting for us to have this opportunity to kind of put a more multi-sensory look at the lives that the people who lived here experienced. And we'll be doing this throughout the year with something as well for the Chinese Lunar New Year, in the spring for Ramadan, looking at a lot of the Muslim stories that are collected on our Your Story, Our Story project. So again, in one case being very particular, doing a deep dive into a particular religion or culture, but understanding that the tenements over time in New York were home to so many immigrants and migrants, and using this as a wonderful model. Thank you tonight for helping us inaugurate this and launch this kind of series of looking into so I invite you all to tune in. I also want to mention one last thing in terms of the multisensory. We have, here's an image of Sarah Lohman, who is our food historian, who this weekend brought to life a recipe from a 1901 Yiddish cookbook. She made a citron cake, and people liked it. It was from 1901, and people still liked it. We'll be doing that again this Sunday at the museum, so hope you can join us. And again, wanting to thank all of you in the audience tonight, all of you watching at home, and thank you for your support of the Tenement Museum, and also a big, huge thanks to our amazing crew, Noriko and Chelsea and Stephen and Jacob and Dolan for moderating the chat, and also a welcome to Mitch, who will be helping us in our crew going forward. So we're one big happy family at the Tenement Museum throughout all the holidays and non-holidays. Thank you so much. Good night.